From where I'm sitting, a recession is beginning to look almost inevitable. It's just a matter of when. So in today's video, I'd like to share with you a few things that you can start doing today to help prepare. But before we jump into that, what is a recession? In simple terms, a recession is a slowdown or a significant decline in economic activities that lasts for several months and in some cases years. So why should you care? Isn't this something for politicians and economists to worry about? The bad news is that recessions tend to affect the wider public in various ways. Generally, during recessions, investments lose value, businesses fail, and unemployment rises. Overall, people tend to experience a lower standard of living due to tightening credit, employment uncertainty, investment losses, and reduced consumer confidence. So why do I think a recession is on its way, especially when, up until recently, the media have been reporting a strong economic recovery? Number one, energy prices. The cost of heating our homes has absolutely rocketed in the last few months. Many people here in the UK were shocked to receive a notification of just how much their increased monthly costs would be. My bill has increased from £137 a month to £270 a month, which is absolutely ridiculous and has resulted in me just trying to not have the heating on as much as possible. And I'm not the only one feeling the pinch. Energy provider Octopus Energy has been giving away electric blankets to their most vulnerable customers to help them keep bills as low as possible. Richard Walker, boss of supermarket chain Iceland, claimed last month that some food bank users are declining items such as potatoes and root vegetables as they cannot afford the energy to boil them. It's already a sorry state of affairs and it's due to get worse. We will likely get a small reprieve in the summer months when we can get away with using less energy to heat our homes. But in October, prices are expected to rise yet again by up to 32% on top of the 54% energy cap increase in April. This incredible increase in such a basic living cost will mean many families can just spend on the essentials and they just won't have funds left over to spend on things like clothing, hospitality, etc. Number two, inflation. Prices are rising at their highest level for decades, and the Office of Budget Responsibility has suggested inflation could reach a 40-year high of 8.7% by the last quarter of this year. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually reach double figures. Put simply, prices are rising on many everyday items with no sign of slowing, and ultimately means that you can buy less for the same amount of money. It's also bad for savers, as high inflation combined with low interest rates means even less opportunity for return on your savings. Typically, inflation is managed through rises in interest rates. This can be good news for savers, but mortgage costs can rise for those on tracker products. Higher interest rates can also cause the housing market to slow or even fall. Now, this might sound like good news for first-time buyers, but lending criteria tends to get a lot stricter during times of uncertainty. Last month, the Bank of England raised interest rates for the third time in just a few months, with interest rates expected to rise further in the coming months. Personally, I don't think these rises in interest rates are going to be enough to combat the levels of inflation we're seeing right now, especially as some of the external forces like energy prices cannot be controlled by interest rates, so we could potentially be facing a period of persistent inflation. Number three, food prices. There have been warnings from food industry bosses that prices could rise by up to 15% this year. There are a wide number of reasons for this. Supply chain disruptions over the last 2 years, fertilizer is in short supply and purchasing costs have therefore risen. The cost of gas, sometimes used to heat greenhouses, as we know, has risen. And then the conflict in the so-called breadbasket of the world is sending wheat prices soaring. It's a very complex issue made up of many factors, and sadly, I don't see many of these factors resolving quickly. Unfortunately, as costs rise for producers and suppliers, inevitably these costs are passed on to the consumer. With another basic cost of living rising, households will have less money to spend on non-essentials in the wider economy. Number four, fuel prices. Many people have been noticing the price hikes at the pumps recently, and this will undoubtedly have an impact on household finances. At a basic level, it means the cost of transport simply to and from work has risen, putting even further pressure on household budgets. Now, of course, some people may choose to utilise public transport more, but there are many jobs where that simply isn't viable. Increased fuel costs can also have knock-on effects on many other sectors. For example, if distribution costs increase, then eventually those costs end up being transferred to the consumer. Number five, stagnant wages. Wage growth simply isn't keeping up with inflation and the rising cost of living. There are some sectors that have where there is high demand, like lorry drivers, for example. But when you look at the entire market, once you take inflation into account, regular pay fell by 1% compared to 12 months ago. And I am absolutely confident there will be people out there who haven't received any pay rises in the last few years, so they're even worse off than that 1% decline. All of these things, yet again, are putting pressure on household finances. Number 6, tax rises. And then the cherry on top. In the spring budget, the Chancellor hiked national insurance rates and local council tax increased by up to 5%. Now, these rises aren't exactly huge in of themselves, but at a time when many families will be struggling to balance the books, they weren't exactly welcome. There are multiple other factors in what is a very complex situation, but those are some of the reasons why I think we could be in for a potential bumpy ride, and a recession could be all but inevitable. So what can you do about it? What can you do to prepare? Quick disclaimer, I am not a financial advisor, so think of this video as a money-minded friend sharing with you what they do. So the first thing I'd recommend doing is to build an emergency fund. If you haven't started on this already, I would highly recommend making this a real priority if you can. The typical advice is to save around 3 to 6 months basic living expenses as an emergency fund, and this can be a real godsend if you happen to be unfortunate enough to face a job loss. If you have already started an emergency fund, you might want to consider bolstering that to around 12 months basic living expenses. During recessions and the inevitable unemployment increase, it can take a little bit longer to find suitable new employment in the event of a job loss. Personally, I like to keep around 6 to 12 months basic living expenses as an emergency fund. I just find that gives me a greater peace of mind and makes me kind of less worried about the curveballs that life tends to throw at you. Number 2, pay down debt. Now, I'm very lucky in that I don't have any debt other than my mortgage, but if I did, I would definitely be looking to pay down debt now, especially things like credit cards and especially things that have high interest rates. Now, this does come with a slight caveat though, because there's a very good reason why this point came after build an emergency fund. Of course, paying off your credit cards and any other finance would be brilliant, but if in doing so you leave yourself with absolutely no buffer in terms of savings, you could be in a more difficult position if you happen to lose your job. So there's definitely a balance to be made there. Number 3, avoid taking on additional debt. Now, whilst I prefer to pay for things in cash, when times are good and prospects rosy, then taking on something like a car loan or additional finance usually isn't a problem if you can afford the monthly payments and afford to save. But during economic downturns, then these things become more risky. The chances of unemployment or reduced business income increases. Now, if those things were to happen, your ability to manage that debt might decrease. So it's usually better to wait on bigger purchases if you can, and taking on any additional debt should be approached with caution. Number 4, learn how to budget and reassess your lifestyle. Okay, so I know no one really wants to hear this, especially after 2 years of limited socializing and spending loads of time at home. Many of us were ready to make up for lost time and really enjoy ourselves this year. But as much as I hate to say it, now would be a really good time to start living within your means and assessing your budget. Setting a budget and cutting down on non-essential expenditure is also a great way of being able to reach point 1 and 2, building an emergency fund and paying down debt. Now, I have several videos here on my channel talking about setting budgets, no spend challenges, and identifying shopping habits that might help. And I know it might sound really boring at first, but it's actually really empowering to take control of your finances, and it's better to start today than wait until it's a pressing issue. Number 5, increase income. Now, this is something that can be really hard to do, so it's why I've left it almost until last. But some people choose to take on an additional job, maybe something like an evening bar job when times are tough, but even this can be challenging in a depressed job market. One of the things you could do though is potentially sell some of the things you might have that you no longer use or need. Also, when times are difficult, a lot more people look to secondhand to make their money go further, so you might find there's an even larger market for your secondhand items than previously. And then lastly, number 6, don't panic. Now, whilst I know all these increased costs with potential further rises can seem really scary right now, often these things kind of don't tend to be as bad as they initially seem. Yes, some belt tightening might be needed, but we may not see, huge unemployment rates and things could recover really quickly. Even people that have lived through previous downturns will tell you that yes, it can be bumpy at times, but you usually make it out okay in the end. Also, there's every possibility that my hunch could be wrong. Even some of the world's best economists struggle to correctly predict the markets every time. Remember that huge crash in house prices we were predicted after the first lockdown? Well, it never materialized. Instead, we ended up with a white hot market. But if I am wrong and you've taken some of these steps just in case, then the worst that can happen is that you have some extra savings, maybe enough to really treat yourself when times are less uncertain. There's never a bad time to make better financial decisions, and anything you can do today to put yourself in a stronger financial position will make life easier should difficult times present themselves. So that's it for today's video. Now, I haven't included details in relation to investments, but of course there are steps that you can take in that regard also. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye now.